Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. For those who joining us for the first time, my name is Alina Bonadonna, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator today. And we have the distinct pleasure to hosting Professor Lucia Anelich, a renowned expert in the field of food safety. Hi, Lucia, how are you? Hello, hello, you're muted.
Hello, I'm now unmuted. How are
Yeah.
you? Nice to be with you, Alina.
As always, a pleasure to talk to you, and especially a greatest pleasure to see so many people join us for so insightful session. Can you just briefly introduce yourself before we start?
Sure. It's my name is Lucia Anelich. I'm from South Africa. I run my own food safety and training consulting business, Anelich Consulting, and I've been doing this since I left university many, many years ago, which I obviously won't divulge. And I've been involved in academia. I am adjunct professor at a University of Technology in South Africa called the Central University of Technology. And so my work is very, very varied. And I'm a very proud member of the ICMSF as well. So thank you, Alina, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be with you and, of course, with all the people who have registered for this webinar.
Thank you so much, Lucia, for joining us, and thanks to Nemis Technologies for supporting such young but so important educational project. And before we begin, let's do a very quick technical checkup. Guys, you know what to do. Please click on one of the reaction icons at the bottom left corner on your screen to confirm that you can interact with the platform. You can see us well, hear us well. I see already a lot of likes, but where are hearts, guys? It should be a lot of hearts because we are. Yes, hearts are coming because of such brilliant, beautiful ladies joining us today. And of course, don't hesitate to drop your question in the chat. Also, during the presentation, we will address the question during the QA session at the end of the session. So, without further words, I give a warm virtual welcome to Lucia, and we are eager to learn from you. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. So here we go. My talk today is all about Listeria monocytogenes and the challenges that we typically are facing in South Africa with regulating Listeria monocytogenes in food. And I wanted to share this with you because it is an important point in terms of highlighting various issues around it, but mainly the difficulty in understanding the difference between a hazard and a risk. Because in this particular case, you will see as I go along that this has become certainly a confusing situation. So one of the most important things I want to mention, first of all, is that anything I mention in this talk, where I refer to the Listeriosis outbreak in 2017 and 2018, and where I reference specific brands or specific companies, these are made only where the information is already in the public domain. Because neither myself nor my business, we are not apportioning blame to any company that may be mentioned. And of course, the entire situation hasn't really been sorted out yet because the case claim is still in place. And whether it goes to court or not is a different situation. It's something that will possibly happen or not happen in the future. So my presentation is going to be about giving you a brief overview of Listeria monocytogenes as a human pathogen in particular, because I just wanted to sort of set the scene without a full lecture on Listeria monocytogenes, of course. Then I'll move into the outbreak and give you some facts around the outbreak, legislation that was established following the outbreak, and then consequences of inappropriate legislation that we have also tried to promulgate in South Africa. So the organism itself causes foodborne listeriosis in humans. It's a relatively rare disease, even though we hear a lot about it, with approximately 1,600 cases in the United States annually, compared to millions of cases of salmonellosis. So the question has to be asked, why is it so important? Why so much focus on Listeria monocytogenes? Well, simply because it causes 20 to 30% deaths in mainly the vulnerable people, compared to approximately 1,000 deaths from salmonellosis. Apologies, of 1% of deaths from salmonellosis. So you're looking at a relatively low percentage for something like salmonella infections in comparison to Listeria monocytogenes infections. The organism itself is an environmental saprophyte, and this is a very important point. So please take this through the presentation with you, because this relates directly to later when I talk about a hazard versus a risk. So you find it in the environment. You're going to find it in rivers and water bodies and dams and lakes and sewage and silage and decaying vegetation, because it's a saprophytic organism. So it's out there. It's doing its job in breaking down whatever it needs to break down in the natural environment. But because of all of this abundant food, which is organic in nature, human food is also organic in nature, and therefore it grows and lives very well in human food under certain circumstances. It certainly prefers moist, wet environments in food processing facilities. It's also a facultative anaerobe, and one of the most important outstanding characteristics of Listeria monocytogenes is that it grows at refrigeration temperatures as low as minus 1.5 degrees Celsius. Very slowly, obviously, but it can grow at such low temperatures. It's also quite tolerant to salt. It's comfortable around 12% salt concentrations, but it can also survive right up to a 20% salt concentration, which is high for microorganisms, especially in the pathogen kind of category. It's easily killed by cooking at a specific temperature, and pasteurization of milk at typically 72.1 or 72.2 degrees Celsius, which is flash pasteurization, will kill the organism. And so that is why it becomes a relatively important product in ready-to-eat foods, where there is a potential for post-processing contamination, or foods where there wasn't an adequate so-called Listeria kill that was applied to that product. It causes two forms of illness mainly. There's the mild form, which occurs, and we call it febrile gastroenteritis. This is typically what occurs in healthy individuals, and it has most of the characteristics of foodborne illness. Fever, there's watery diarrhea, there's nausea, there's some headache, and pains in joints and muscles, which can also be attributed to certain other pathogens. It typically occurs 24 hours after ingesting relatively high levels of Listeria mono, but it can be as short as 6 hours, or it can be as long as 10 days before one starts to actually get any symptoms. The disease itself usually lasts about 2 days, but it can also last a week. And because of the fact that it is a normal foodborne illness where you get your nausea, your diarrhea, maybe in this case not necessarily vomiting, you would typically not always go and seek medical assistance. So it is probably underreported, unless it's a massive outbreak that occurs amongst a lot of people, then it's typically underreported. The second form of illness is the more severe type. This is the systemic listeriosis, which becomes invasive in high-risk individuals, and they are typically your very, very young, less than a year old, the elderly over the age of 65. Pregnant women are particularly vulnerable, and their unborn babies are so, and then the immunocompromised, of course. And examples of such individuals are those with cancer, HIV/AIDS, which we have quite a high prevalence of in South Africa, diabetes, organ transplant patients that are on steroids that are suppressing their immune system to stop the rejection of the organ that was transplanted. That, of course, suppresses the immune system, which is going to also affect one's risk of listeriosis infection. Inflammatory diseases, same thing, where people are on corticosteroids of some sort that are suppressing the immune system. And even people where the acidity of the stomach is not as acid as it should be, can also be a higher risk. And those are typically people who are taking proton pump inhibitors when they have acid reflux conditions. And just to remind everyone where South Africa is, right at the bottom of the African continent, and that's typically where we had the outbreak. But it did affect our trade with many of the countries surrounding us, specifically in the southern part of Africa itself. And I will show you some examples there too later. So on the 3rd of September 2018, the largest documented listeriosis outbreak in history was declared officially over by our Department of Health. And at that point, we had 1,065 documented cases, and I want to emphasize the word documented, with 218 recorded deaths. And again, I want to emphasize the word recorded. But the NICD, the National Institute for Communicable Diseases in South Africa, which was the organization that was investigating this outbreak and doing all the testing, later published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which stated that actually there were 937 cases and 193 deaths. The reason for this is these are the ones that were attributed to a particular strain that was the one that was found in the majority of cases, namely the ST6 strain. But there were other deaths as well that were not necessarily attributed to the ST6 strain, and hence why we have a larger number of cases and deaths that were recorded. So if we look back at the last set of statistics that were released in 26th of July 2018, this is the graph that was released by the NICD, that institute that I mentioned earlier. And it shows very clearly how children and babies in particular of less than 28 days of age were infected and affected by our outbreak. By far the majority were in fact in this group. And then the group of 15 to 49 years, and we also know that this is the group that is the most prevalent related to HIV/AIDS. So by all means, yes, these are a lot of people that are HIV positive and that were affected. And then you can see those above the age of 65 and some unknown ages that were recorded. But by far the majority, which is quite different to most listeriosis outbreaks in the rest of the world, is where these youngsters, very, very young babies, were in fact affected. However, we do not know how many miscarriages occurred that could have been related to this particular outbreak. We do not know how many stillbirths occurred in various hospitals across the country that might have been attributed to listeriosis. And the elderly in the old age homes, the care homes, typically when people are elderly in their 80s or 90s and they do pass away, people typically would say, well, it was their time. But we also don't know how many of those people that passed away may have passed on because they, in fact, were listeriosis positive. And then in South Africa, we have what we call waste pickers. These are people that come to our dustbins every single day when they are put out for collection, and they scratch around in our dustbins for anything that they can recycle. It's including plastic in particular, recyclable plastic and paper, any materials other than that they can recycle and easily transport because they transport these on foot. Glass, not so much because glass is heavy, But these waste pickers then also land up on landfill areas, and they will pick up food that looks appealing and that looks as though it can be consumed. And many consumers in South Africa were in fact throwing away the potentially affected product into their dustbins. And these products would obviously land up on landfills. And we know that these waste pickers were picking up this food and consuming it. So we do not know how many of those people were in fact potentially affected by this outbreak either. So there are many unknowns in this situation. So the NICD, as I mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about them here, they regard themselves as leaders in reference microbiology, virology, epidemiology, surveillance, public health research and training. And in fact, they do a lot of surveillance in South Africa, and they have an enteric disease unit. And it was that particular unit that was investigating this outbreak and documenting all the cases. So the facility that was affected, apparently affected, was in Polokwane, which is north of Johannesburg, about 4 hours drive. And when the environmental health practitioners, together with the NICD, went into this facility, they found the ST6 strain, which was identified through whole genome sequencing, in the facility, as well as on the product, and then, of course, in the patients. So that was the disease triangle that was completed. And that's how the NICD came to the conclusion that the enterprise brand of products were the source of this outbreak. And what Tiger Brands did, which is the owner, the company that owned the enterprise brand, they decided to conduct a full recall. All of their products, whether they were ready to eat, which is the typical polony, which is like a bologna sausage, as far as I understand. It's similar to the bologna that you would find in the US. It's made from MDM, mechanically deboned meat, mainly mechanically deboned chicken, and then a whole lot of spices and other ingredients are added. It's encased in this plastic packaging. It's clipped on the ends, and then it is cooked fully, and it becomes a ready-to-eat product with a relatively long shelf life in the refrigerator. It is not a frozen product, it's a refrigerated product. But what Tiger Brands decided to do is to even recall ready-to-cook products like bacon and all sorts of others that they used to make, because they just didn't want to take any further risk related to any potential cross-contamination. And in fact, 5,900 tons of product was recalled. It's the largest recall that's ever occurred in South Africa. And it was treated by the environmental department, government department, national authority, as medical/hazardous waste. With the result, to get rid of this huge amount of product really gave us some challenges in South Africa. So some of it was sent to cement kilns, which operate at above 800 degrees Celsius. And of course, it was incinerated in those kilns. It was also sent to hospital incinerators and was also buried in Class A landfills as hazardous waste. And these are the landfills in South Africa that are regarded, that are used for very, very high risk type of waste. And it was very important in this particular case for the Class A landfills that we ensured that they are not identifiable, because we were worried that people would actually go and dig up this food and consume it. So it was really important that it was done in a very, very careful way, so that people didn't know where they were, these landfill sites. And then during the outbreak, 15 December 2017, our Minister of Health declared that Listeriosis is a notifiable disease in South Africa. So from then onwards, it became notifiable. So what about the economic and trade and impact? Well, that was huge, because at the time, Tiger Brands had around 35.7% market share of all processed meats that were produced in South Africa or that were sold as well in South Africa. So the fact that nothing more was being produced because the factories were shut down, the entire supply chain was affected. The logistics, people who were transporting these products were not transporting. Retailers, their shelves were empty because of the large amount of product that would have taken up their space that was no longer available and was no longer being produced. All the suppliers were affected, whether it was ingredients, packaging material, and even pork suppliers were affected. And that was one of the unfortunate consequences of this outbreak. Is our Minister of Health made the unfortunate remark and said to the public, you mustn't consume any pork product just to be on the safe side. So the bottom tanked out completely of our pork industry, and they were losing millions a week, the pork farmers. They were in fact slaughtering and burying their pigs because it just didn't pay for them to take them to market to be slaughtered. They didn't have a customer base. They were losing that very, very fast. 15 African countries banned all food from South Africa, regardless of risk. There were countries in Africa that stopped our export of fresh fruit, like grapes and apples, which had absolutely no risk related to Listeria monocytogenes. So this was also one of the unfortunate side effects of this outbreak. And then in South Africa, we were testing everything. Conventional testing methods, rapid testing methods, whole genome sequencing. But specific for the conventional testing, we needed media. And we were running out of media so fast because all the labs were testing left, right, and center. We could not import media fast enough into the country to have the supply that we needed. And then an interesting project that was put out by the Department of Trade and Industry at the time to Deloitte was to try and determine what the impact was financially to the country. And even though the report was never made public, and I was part of this project because I was brought in by Deloitte as the food safety expert to work with them on this, we did estimate that it cost the South African economy 6 billion rand, which is in the region of $328 million. Now, perhaps in US terms, it doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in South African terms, it's a huge amount of money because taking our GDP for the year 2018, which was around $290 billion, you can see clearly that it was actually a huge impact for our small country. And this was only related to direct costs. We didn't take the indirect costs into consideration because we couldn't actually determine them with the team that we had at the time. So this is where we were when we ended this particular project. So what were the industry and government reactions to this outbreak? Well, industry, of course, went into flat panic. And people producing all sorts of products, and you can name them, were testing everything. We were testing UHT milk, UHT juices, alcohol, beer, wine, poultry, fruit, all sorts of fruits, boiled sweets that were, wrapped, baked breads and all sorts of cookies and muffins and soft drinks, preserved jams, coffee, tea. The list goes on and on and on because everybody just became completely panic-stricken around this outbreak. And is it in my product? Could it be in my product? I'm going to test, even though the risk for many of these products is negligible, if not absent. And that's went on for quite a period of time. And it was difficult to get the industry to just calm down and understand where the risk really lies. Which brings me to our government reaction. Now, we have a very fragmented system in South Africa. We've got the Department of Health, Agriculture, and we have a Department of Trade and Industry, and they all have a food regulatory mandate. The Department of Health and Agriculture, one can understand. We've got the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, which looks at post-farm gate, if you want to create a division, post-farm gate food. And under this act, we have our HACCP regulation. For the Department of Agriculture, it's pre-farm gate. It's all the raw meat, it's abattoirs, game meat, that sort of thing. And that falls under the Meat Safety Act. Now, each of these departments have many other acts, and it becomes quite complex, but I'm not showing you all that gory detail. All I'm showing you is really what was applicable or is applicable to this particular situation. And then the Department of Trade and Industry has a division called the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications. Now, the NRCS is an interesting body. It has this food regulatory mandate as well, and it looks at all canned fish, canned meat, abalone, mollusks, and crayfish and lobsters and those and crabs, all that sort of meat that we export and all of that we may be importing into South Africa. And they're also the designated authority, the competent authority for fresh fish export to the EU. And they have to then do the proper inspections according to EU requirements of any fish that leaves the South African borders, shores, for the European Union. So they have quite an important mandate. And keeping in mind that up until this outbreak, we had no regulated levels for Listeria monocytogenes in any of our laws, whether it fell under health, agriculture, industry, or the Department of Trade and Industry. So the first change that was made by government was under the Department of Health, and that was to extend our HACCP regulation. And by the way, for those of you in Europe, HACCP is not a blanket requirement across all food industries in South Africa. It's only across certain food industries, and it was extended in March 2019 to all processors of ready-to-eat heat-treated meat products as defined in this particular standard, which is the South African National Standard 885, which I will also chat to a little bit. And then also any others that are related in the same way, but made from poultry preparations and products. So meat, edible meat offal, also poultry. Anything that was then ready to eat, heat-treated, would fall under this HACCP requirement from March 2019. And when I talk HACCP, I talk HACCP according to Codex. The second change that was made was related to this NRCS, the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications. They then became the regulatory body for ready-to-eat processed meat products under this National Standard 885, which is about these products. And the important thing here is that the NRCS is a really good inspection body because of the fact that it is doing HACCP EU inspections. It knows exactly what it's doing, and it has a specifically very good mandate. And it is ISO 17020 accredited as an inspection body. And it was one of the first in the world to be accredited to ISO 17020. And this is a very strict requirement for inspection bodies. They have to follow very, very strict rules, and they are maintaining this accreditation. And therefore, their inspections are really top-notch. And I think it's a good thing that this regulatory body has taken on the inspections of these products in South Africa. And I mentioned the South African National Standard 885, which is now mandated by the NRCS as the standard that the industry has to follow. And they've mandated it under VC 9100, which is a compulsory specification that they put out. So if we look at SANS 885, which we revised, I was part of that committee that revised it in 2022 because it was in existence before, but it wasn't very well written. We've divided it up into a section on food safety criteria, similar to the European regulation, and process hygiene criteria. And in the food safety criteria, we have followed the Codex route, which is ready to eat RTE products able to support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. 5 is the number of samples you take. C is 0. In other words, none of the 5 samples may exceed your microbiological limit, which is absent in 25 grams in this particular case. And we use ISO 11290-1, which is the default method. We just call it SANS 11290-1 because we adopt ISO methods. We are permitted to do that under the South African Bureau of Standards. And then ready-to-eat products unable to support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes during its shelf life is also 5 samples are taken. None may exceed the maximum limit of 100 colony-forming units per gram. And that's very, very similar to the European Union requirements. And in fact, it's the same as Codex. So that's been accepted, and it is now what is inspected against by the NRCS. So we've had the first change, which was the change to the HACCP regulation to bring in these products that are ready to eat and high risk related to Listeria monocytogenes. The second change we had was the compulsory specification for processed meat products, as I have just shown you. And then, no problem. This is perfectly correct because we've got the 2 groups in South Africa that understand that this is a ready-to-eat product and this is where the risk lies and the requirements are appropriate. But then that's when things went pear-shaped, where things started to go wrong. The Department of Agriculture decided to come on board. And they promulgated, or they didn't promulgate it as such. It's actually still a draft document, but it is being used, even though it's a draft. This so-called VPN 52. It's a veterinary procedure on the sampling, the removal of samples for examination, testing and examining of microbiological test results of meat under the Meat Safety Act. But this VPN includes all raw meat. It's a blanket requirement, whether it's beef, lamb, goat, pork, poultry, rabbit, ostrich, any meat, crocodile meat, it's all included under this VPN. And that's where most of the problem comes in. So I'm only going to take raw poultry as an example. And these are the pathogens that this VPN requires the raw poultry industry, and I want to emphasize raw poultry, to test for. First one being Campylobacter. Comfortable. We know Campylobacter is a risk in poultry. However, and I'm not going to talk about all the limits because that's not what we are here for today, just an aside, they want an absent in 25 grams requirement for Campylobacter in raw poultry. Salmonella, agreed, but they want an absent in 25 gram for all Salmonella species, regardless of whether it's anything not related to Typhimurium or Enteritidis. Clostridium perfringens in raw poultry. They also want raw poultry to be tested for S-tech E. coli. And of course, my favorite, Listeria monocytogenes in raw poultry. So what are the problems? Furthermore, they want a pathogen environmental monitoring program in poultry abattoirs. And I don't know how many of you have been in a poultry abattoir. It is definitely not a sterile environment. It has blood, it's got water, it's got pieces of skin, it's got pieces of intestines floating around, because that is part of that. It's an abattoir. That's what you would expect to see. It's clean. There's a lot of water being swept up and so on, but you are busy with this kind of processing of a raw material, and especially a raw meat that's come from the environment. You would expect Listeria monocytogenes to be there from time to time. The question is it a genuine risk to human health, considering the intended use of poultry, and we'll get to that. And what they also require is that in this PEM program, Listeria species must be not detected, none of the Listeria species. And they want the abattoirs to be zoned. So typically, if you're in the business of a ready-to-eat meat product, heat-treated in particular, you would know that you would need to zone your premises typically in 4 zones according to a PEM program that you've established in your facility. Well, this regulation, VPN, requires the same thing in a poultry abattoir zoning, which is going to be extremely difficult to do. So when it comes to significance, well, one of the things that this has typically shown us is, yes, we've had a great change at the Department of Health level and a very good change, very applicable at the NRCS level. But do we really need a VPN 52? Is this useful in any way? I think not. And it certainly highlights the fragmentation in our regulatory system when it comes to food, and more so the lack of communication between the 3 departments. There was no discussion around this with the other 2 departments, between agriculture and the other 2, to come to some agreement and some understanding around where the real risk lies. Furthermore, we have to raise the issue of food security, especially in a country like South Africa, namely the cost of inappropriate microbiological testing. It's costing the industry around 2 million rand extra per year just to conduct tests that are relatively inappropriate. Some of them are appropriate, of course, but when it comes to Listeria monocytogenes, STEC, E. coli in poultry, definitely inappropriate. The cost is carried to the consumer, and we must remember in South Africa, our poor consumers in particular use poultry greatly because it's the most affordable form of protein that they can purchase. So it's a big consumable product in South Africa, very, very widely consumed. In a country where 20 million people go to bed hungry at night, this is not helpful at all. And furthermore, the scientific justification is something we need to ask. Where is it? If we simply look at Codex, forget about literature and all the great articles that have been published over time in literature that shows clearly it's not a risk in a raw meat product like poultry. But let's just take a look at the Codex documents that speak to this. Firstly, the Codex Alimentarius Commission document on microcriteria states that you need to identify a need for microcriteria at a specified point in the food chain based on risk to the consumer. A second one, which is on the hygienic practice for meat, speaks about risk-based approach to meat hygiene. Hygiene measures should be applied at those points in the food chain where they will be of greatest value in reducing foodborne risks to consumers. Again, the word risk. Another paragraph in this document states that one should ensure that options selected protect the health of consumers, but that they are also scientifically justifiable, proportionate to the risk identified, and are not more restrictive to trade or technological innovation than required to achieve an appropriate level of protection. And then there's a third one. The guidelines on the application of general principles of food hygiene to the control of Listeria monocytogenes in food. The scope of this document is ready-to-eat foods. Annex 2 speaks to microcriteria for Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods, and it's stated very clearly. And Annex 3 states recommendations for the use of microtesting for environmental monitoring, process control verification by competent authorities for various reasons, for Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods again. So this keeps popping up throughout the document because that is indeed the scope of the document. Now, this document is currently under revision by Codex, and however, the current document that's been circulated for comment is still only focusing on ready-to-eat foods because that hasn't changed. The risk hasn't changed. When it comes to trade, what we are finding in South Africa is that where certain providers of fresh meat and fresh poultry would like to enter into certain retail stores, those retailers are saying, are you complying with VPN 52? We want to see your results for Estec E. coli, for Listeria monocytogenes, etc., etc. And when those customers or suppliers rather are saying, well, we can't guarantee absent in 25 grams as required by VPN 52, then those retailers are reticent to stock those supplier products on their shelves because they are obviously very careful of any legal backlash should something happen. And so we're sitting with this kind of situation with a draft document that is not fully promulgated, that is being implemented by retailers that are requiring this testing to be done. Some of it is inappropriate, and we are seeing that trade is being blocked because of this requirement. And then when it comes to imports, should a veterinary inspector find Listeria monocytogenes in imported raw beef or chicken, that entire consignment is rejected. So again, one has to ask, what is the value of that? How helpful is it? And then I want to address this issue around hazard versus risk. I hope I've been able to show you that Listeria monocytogenes, through the various slides I have shown you thus far, is a significant hazard, and we know that. And therefore, it would certainly be a risk in ready-to-eat processed meats and must be controlled. And whatever control measure one puts in place, that could be a CCP, would have to be very well monitored, validated, etc., etc. All the good things that you need to have in place in your HACCP-based program. However, is it a hazard or a risk in raw poultry? We know it's a hazard because it's a pathogen. Therefore, it is an identified hazard when you do your hazard identification in your HACCP system. But when it comes to determining whether it's a risk in raw poultry, we have to ask questions. What is the intended use of the product? Because we don't eat raw poultry. The perishability of fresh poultry, and I'm not talking frozen, I'm talking fresh poultry, is short. It has a very short shelf life. Listeria monocytogenes, if present, will likely be present in very, very low numbers, which is not a risk to consumers besides the fact that we don't eat raw poultry. And furthermore, when it's amongst other organisms, Listeria monocytogenes is not a good competitor. And therefore, its numbers will probably be kept relatively low in such products that are anyway going to be cooked before consumption. So I ask the question again, is it a risk in raw poultry? And I would contend that it isn't. And to take you to a completely different type of discussion, but certainly very relevant to what we are speaking about here, is a recent publication by colleagues of mine in the ICMSF, namely John Donaghy from Nestlé, Marcel Zwittering from the University of Wageningen, and Jeffrey Farber from the University of Guelph in Canada, retired, but nevertheless still associated with the university, is a really good paper on where they elaborate on when a hazard is a risk and when a hazard is not a risk, which just underscores what I have been showing you in my slides. And the title of their publication is "A hazard does not always equate to a risk." And they use Chronobacter. Yes, they use Chronobacter in powdered infant formula and human breast milk, but the concept and the message remains the same. So I think that's probably one of the most important things I wanted to also just convey to you is that we need to understand the difference between a hazard-based decision and a risk-based so-called scientific decision. And when it comes to promulgating these kind of regulations, we need to look further, and we're not only from a science-based perspective, but what impact do those kinds of decisions have on a country like ours, where you have many millions of people who are going hungry and cannot afford to pay more for a product that is arguably very safe for human consumption, even though we're not going to test it for Listeria monocytogenes. So with that, I'd like to thank you very, very much again, Alina, Nemis Academy, and all of you who have registered for this webinar. I hope I have shed some light and would invite you all to travel to South Africa in June and to attend the Food Safety Summit that I host, and I will be hosting on the 3rd and the 4th in Johannesburg. And with that, thank you, Alina, and I believe it's time for questions.
Yeah, definitely. And I see already a lot of reactions coming appreciating your beautiful slides and so insightful presentation, because guys, we really cannot underestimate the risk. And I see already quite a bit of questions here, so let's start with the first one which arrived during the presentation. Why other countries from Asia and Africa are not talking much about this pathogen?
Well, we do talk a lot about it in South Africa. I think in Africa, Africa is an interesting continent. There are so many other issues that Africa is dealing with besides political upheavals. People are relatively poor in Africa. It's a high level of poverty. People don't have a lot of access to food, and so they take what they can. And that's unfortunately leads to typically foodborne diseases, not necessarily just related to Listeria monocytogenes, but certainly to others as well. And in Africa, we don't tend to document these things. There is very little foodborne disease surveillance. So there's very little talk about whether Listeria is being isolated from this product or that product, or whether there is an outbreak of Listeriosis. In many countries, we simply wouldn't know that. And that is one of the main reasons why there is not a lot of talk about it in Africa. And I would assume that in Asia, certainly in certain countries in Asia, that would also be a similar situation.
Yeah, that's why, guys, you have to attend our Nemis Academy webinars. Because we do talk about these issues and we do invite such amazing experts like Lucia itself. So, next question. Is there anything known about the minimal infection doses of El Mono, CFU?
It's believed that it is in the region of 10 to the 4 colony forming units per gram, around 10,000. The United States speaks of 100,000, 10 to the 5. But generally speaking, 10 to the 4 seems to be the minimum infectious dosage, although we don't know exactly. And it might be lower for the immunocompromised, the so-called YOPI group.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, probably there is one question from a person who entered a bit late, but anyway, do you find some similarities between fresh produce and raw poultry regarding inappropriate testing?
That's a very good question, because I know in the US there's a lot of work being done on Listeria monocytogenes and fresh produce. The issue is sometimes also difficult in terms of societal sophistication, if I can put it that way. I think generally speaking, people are not that worried about fresh produce. We've done a lot of testing in South Africa on fresh produce of different kinds, vegetables as well as fruit. And it's practically non-existent, Listeria monocytogenes, or extremely low in numbers, not enough to actually cause illness. So there isn't a lot of concern around fresh produce. There also isn't concern amongst the poultry industry, not only in South Africa, but in other, even developed countries, around raw poultry and Listeria monocytogenes, because we accept it's going to be there because it's an environmental organism. It's coming in with the chickens that are coming in the cages and the trucks. So
Yeah.
surely there will be, despite the fact that we've got cleaning and chlorine, we allowed chlorinated water in South Africa. So there is all of that going on in the facilities, but certainly the organism will be there from time to time. It's natural, but it isn't a risk, and that's the point that one tries to make. The fact that it's present doesn't constitute automatically a risk.
Thank you so much. And just now I shared the link, which was shared by Lucia. Your camera is off. If you are here, just let me know.
Yes,
I hope you are still
I'm
here.
aware of it. Thank you. Trying to get
Yeah.
it on
So
track.
while I will just comment my recent link, which I shared. It was shared by Karen Goodburn. Thank you, Karen, for watching us. And it was a note from her because it's not a question, but another paper regarding the risk. All food processes have a residual risk. Some are small, some very small, and some are extremely small. Zero
Yeah,
risk does not exist. So, and the
correct.
link to it you can find in the recent post from me. And also, she added US regulatory system classified pathogens as fields when they are a natural part of the ecosystem. And a huge and warm hi to Lucia. Karen, we are also looking forward to host you here. So
Yeah.
now
Hi,
I'm using
Karen.
the opportunity.
Absolutely. Nice to hear from you, and thank you for that. Such
Yeah,
an
yeah.
important point, the zero risk, such an important point. It doesn't exist. And that is why requiring, never mind the testing of Listeria mono in raw poultry, but even requiring an absent in 25 grams, it makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever. And it brings us back to that point that Karen was making. There is no zero risk. It's about minimizing the risk as far as possible and about putting in the controls where it's the most appropriate to reduce that risk as far as possible for the consumer. And raw poultry is not where that risk is for Listeria monocytogenes.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really very important note. Next question is coming. Is a limit present for food intended for infants and for special medical purposes, similar to you?
We don't have one yet. Um, there is, coming back to our fragmented system, the Department of Health is still needing to develop limits for Listeria monocytogenes in food, which would include for infants and special medical foods for special medical purposes. It would certainly be included in that regulation, which still has to be revised. What our Department of Health has been waiting for has been the revised guidelines for Listeria monocytogenes that are currently underway. They didn't want to promulgate something and then have to change it should those guidelines change. So that is why we still have this gap where we still need to do some work and close those gaps appropriately.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another question about tiger brands. Actually, I was waiting for it. So, what are some of the possible reasons tiger brands missed the presence of El Mono as a risk when the colony was released and subsequently caused the outbreak?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it because it's still a legal case. And until that process has been completed, we will not know. And maybe we will never know because it's a whole legal process that has to be undertaken. And so we certainly can't talk about it at this time.
Yeah, you can actually refer directly to Tiger Brands. Maybe they will answer it. Yeah, another question. From the point of view of a buyer, what is an alternative to inappropriate microtesting or results?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
From the point of view of a buyer, what is an alternative to inappropriate microtesting or results? Basically, inappropriate microtesting, probably,
In general,
in
gosh,
general.
there are a lot of things. It depends. It depends on the product. I mean, what I would test for in a dry gravy powder would be quite different to what I would test for in a ready-to-eat heat-treated processed meat versus a salad sauce versus mayonnaise versus any other product that you can think of. The regime would be quite different, and also the levels that one would allow would also probably be different because is it a ready to eat? Is it something that's going to still be cooked? And what are the ingredients? So we need to have a look broadly at all of that before we can determine what to test for, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, and what are the levels that we would allow.
Yeah, and just this person wrote the clarification. I meant nothing related to testing. Basically, what is the alternative to nothing what is related to testing from the point of buyer?
I'm sorry, I still don't understand the question.
Yeah, so if you can, Francis, referring to your question, probably it's really important topic. I do apologize if we cannot interpret it correctly. But while Francis is writing the clarification, I have also a question. It was very interesting example from you, Lucia, related to scientific and political comparison of the reaction on this, like what basically happened on these outbreaks. And what do you think, like, were there some actions related more to perception of data and what was like the goal to hide something, maybe to hide the level, the amount of recalls, maybe to polish a bit public communication, etc. So what do you think about
On
it?
the contrary, I think this outbreak highlighted the importance of conducting recalls when you need to conduct recalls. We also have an act in South Africa, the Consumer Protection Act, which is a very interesting act in that it talks about safety of products and it requires a company to do a recall if the product should be unsafe. And here we're talking broadly products. It can be a toaster, a kettle that blows up in your face or whatever, a car that has problems with airbags, for example. So that would require a recall. So, and it of course includes food products. So it allows for voluntary recalls as well as for mandatory recalls. And it falls under, again, the Department of Trade and Industry, not Health. And they then have what they've set up is a National Consumer Commissioner office. And the NCC will then investigate these kind of situations with the help of the National Department of Health for testing and sampling and so on and so forth. But they take the lead. And companies are required to inform the NCC should they wish to do a voluntary recall. And what we are now seeing is more and more of these kind of voluntary recalls that are occurring. So I think it was positive in that respect.
Yeah, and just now I posted to everyone the note from Karen. So thank you, Karen, for being super active today. And I do invite you again to present this topic as well on live because there are a lot of valuable information regarding Chilled Food Association, which collects like the data. So we got clarification. Should the buyer take the grasp of the HACCP of the supplier, for example, or environmental monitoring result?
should the buyer accept the results of the environmental monitoring for HACCP
Yeah,
related to the HACCP system?
yeah, yeah,
I don't see why not, because it depends also on how broadly the environmental monitoring has occurred. And it would also, again, depend on the product, because you've got environmental monitoring directly after cleaning and disinfection. That environmental monitoring is for determining and verifying that cleaning was effective. But then there's environmental monitoring for pathogens, which is in high risk facilities where you would typically monitor the environment during production, not directly after cleaning, but during production for the identified risks or hazards rather that you have identified through a risk assessment that has been conducted. So in a dry food facility, I would typically focus on Salmonella, for example, and you might be looking at Listeria mono or Chronobacter if you're in a powdered infant formula business. And that's the kind of monitoring you would do of the environment. So it would be good to have a very well designed environmental monitoring system, because you can easily miss the pathogen if you are not swabbing and testing in the right places in your environment. But if you have a good, robust program in place, those results should be acceptable.
yeah. And can, for example, buyer rely on environmental monitoring and not just on micro testing of the product? Of course,
I,
if they are aware of it.
yeah, I would certainly look at both.
Yeah,
I think it's
yeah.
important that you look at the whole picture and not just a portion of it, because environmental monitoring only tells you what is potentially a cross contaminant in a product once it's exposed, after it's undergone a kill step, before it's packed. But there might also be other organisms in the product that are not related to the environment that might be coming through the process. And this is typically where there's no kill step. For example, chocolate. Chocolate's an excellent example because you've got no kill step in chocolate, but you've got a lot of raw ingredients like milk powder and cocoa and other things that come in. And you can do environmental monitoring. And for, say, salmonella, for example, you might not be finding it, but it might be coming into your raw, through your raw ingredients, and then it gets into the chocolate because there's no kill step. And you might then pick it up in your end product, the chocolate itself, but you won't find it necessarily in the environment. And so that's why it's important that you would look at both.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucia. And I hope that we answered the question from Francis. And unfortunately, that would be the last question for today because we are super run out of time. Just grant our speaker the warmest hearts and claps. What I see, we already got some. And yeah, unfortunately, time is limited, even though the topic is super interested in and really very hard to gain within 1 hour. Anyway, guys, I'm super grateful for having you all here, especially Lucia. Thank you for joining us and looking forward to seeing you in our further webinars. Have a nice evening to those who are at the end of their day and those who are watching us in the early morning. Have a nice and cool day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.